Hello everyone, in today's After Effects scripting tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make a useful custom workflow script. You can use this to help speed up your or someone else's workflow. Now, I made a previous tutorial that showed how to make a script that does batch processing, which is kind of similar, but this script is using custom images and such to have a custom workflow for ourselves. So if we take a look, our first two buttons are going to fade in and out the selected video. The second two are going to fade in the selected audio. This button will remove all keyframes of all the selected layers. This will remove all the expressions. This will remove all the effects. And this will reset our transform values like the position and such like that. So if we go ahead and select a few layers here, I'm going to bring up the opacity and go ahead and fade these in. As you can see, it fades them in by a second. And I can also fade these out. And just like that, we've added fades to all of our layers that we've selected in just a few clicks. Now if we go ahead and say, grab this layer here and grab the audio levels, what we can do is fade those in and out as well. And this will make it easy to fade in and out audio or transition in between clips. Now let's say I apply some effects to this leaf footage here, and just add a couple here. If we go ahead and click on the Remove Effects button, it's going to remove our effects for us. Let's go ahead and take a look at the keyframes and expression deletion tools. So if I grab my position, I'll just say wiggle 3 times a second and like 25 pixels. And then for my scale, I'm going to just scale it up over time here to about 150. So now we have our footage scaling up as time goes on, as well as the position being wiggled to add some camera shake. So let's say we wanted to get rid of these and start from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and select some layers here and click on the Remove or Delete Keyframes button. And as you can see, it instantly removes all of our keyframes for us. Now if we want to get rid of our expression on our position here, we'll select the layer and click on Remove Expression. And just like that, we've set everything back to regular. Our opacity is set to 0 and some of our levels are a little off. So what we can do is select all of our layers and click on the Reset Transform Values. And that will change all of our transform values like opacity, scale, and position back to their original values. Alright, so that's the basic way this script is going to be working. Let's go ahead and get started by opening a new extendscript file. This is what we're going to be coding today. It's about 221 lines of code, and we also have some binary images included. So I'll go ahead and create a new JavaScript file and just zoom in a bit. We'll just call this the workflow script. And we'll start off by defining some global variables that we're going to be using throughout the script. The first one we're going to set equal to fade seconds. And this is simply going to be how long our video and audio fade in and outs are going to be. That way we don't have to go into the code and modify it a bunch. We can just set up a variable ahead of time and that will apply to all of them. So by default, I'll just set this to 1 second because that's a pretty standard fade time. And then we're also going to create 2 arrays, one called our opacity values, which is going to contain 2 values, basically the values that we want to fade from. So our opacity change will be from 0 to 100. And then we'll also create one for our audio values. And this is going to be our audio levels of which range we want them to be in. By default, I believe 0 audio is -48 dB. And then we'll want to go up to 0 decibels. Alright, and the next part I'm not going to show you how to do because I have another video already telling you how, which you can check out linked in the description. But we're going to be taking these binary images that I've created, and we're going to use these as our UI. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste those in here, and that should be good. So these are basically each of our buttons that are going to be in our script. And the reason I'm using these rather than referring to a location is so that you guys can use them as well. Alright, so now that we have some basic variables and our icons set up, let's go ahead and create our actual user interface. So we'll start off by defining our main window, which is going to be equal to a new window. It's going to be a palette window, and we'll just call this the workflow script with undefined size. And then we'll grab our main window and we'll set the orientation equal to column from top to bottom. Then we'll create two groups, one for our fades and one for our delete options. So we'll create a new group, we'll just call it our fade group, which is going to be the one on top with all the fade options. And this is going to be equal to our main window. And we're just going to add a group with undefined size, and we'll call it the fade group. Then we'll grab our fade group and we'll set the orientation to row from left to right. And then we need to go ahead and add our buttons. So we'll start off with our fade in button, but this was going to be for video, so we'll call it the video fade in button. And we'll set this equal to our fade group, and we're going to add an image with undefined size. And for the binary icon, we're going to grab our video fade in image and just paste that in there. So now just to check, we're going to grab our main window, center it, and grab our main window and show it. If we go ahead and run it, you can see we have our first icon working successfully. One thing I'm going to do with our image here is I'm going to grab it, so our video fade in button, and I'm going to make sure the size is restricted to say 25 by 25, so a nice square. And we can also add a help tip to this. So we'll grab our video fade in button, and I'll grab the help tip, and we'll set that to a string of text which the user will be able to see. For this, we're just going to say something like fade in the selected layers video by, and then we're going to actually add our fade seconds, and then we'll say seconds after it. So it's basically going to say fade in the selected layer by check what our fade seconds are, seconds. Alright, so I'm going to grab these 3 lines of code we just used here, and I'm going to paste them 3 times below. And let's go ahead and keep track of these here. The first one we're going to change to our video fade out button. And then we're going to change the video fade in image to the video fade out image. And we'll change the size and the help tip. And we'll say fade out rather than in. And then for the other 2, we're going to set these equal to audio fade in button and audio fade out button. And then over here, we're going to set this audio fade in button to our audio fade in image. And then the same thing for this down here, we'll change it to audio fade out image. And then we'll also go ahead and change up the variables here from video to audio. Alright, so now if we go ahead and run it, you can see we have our first row of icons here, and our help tips are working properly. We should change them a little bit here by saying fade out and change video to audio in these 2. Now we're going to want to set up our second group, which is going to be called our delete group, which is going to include deleting the expressions, keyframes, effects, etc. We'll set our delete group equal to our main window, and we're going to add a group with undefined size, and we'll call this the delete group. And just like the previous group, we're going to set the orientation to row from left to right. And now we can start off by doing the delete keyframes button. So I'll create a variable called simply that, delete keyframes button. And we'll set this equal to the delete group. And we're going to add another image, undefined size. And this time we're going to grab our delete keyframes image. And just like before, we're going to grab our element and set the size to be a nice square. And then also set up the help tip. And this is just going to say remove all keyframes from selected layers. Then again, we're going to grab these 3 lines here and paste them 3 times. So after the delete keyframes button, we're going to add a delete expressions button. And we'll change the image source to delete expressions image. Update these. The third button in this group is going to be our delete effects button. Change this to delete effects image. Update these. And finally, the last one is going to be called the reset transform button. and we'll change the image to reset transform image. Alright, so now if we run it, we have everything working well. We have all of our UI elements, and now the only thing left to do is add functionality to these. So with images, we can't directly reference them and call onClick, for example, audio fade out button.onClick. What we actually need to do is grab it and add an event listener. And basically what this is going to do is add a listener for any time we hover over or click on it, depending on what we specify. So I'm going to go down below our UI show here. And the first thing I'm going to need to grab are the first 4 buttons. So I'll grab our video fade in button, our video fade out button, our audio fade in button, and our audio fade out button. And for each of these, we're going to add an event listener. So what we'll do for this is say .add event listener. And this is typically going to require 3 arguments. The first one is what we do. So we'll go ahead and click. And the handler is the function we're going to run into. And the capture phase we'll just set to false. Video fade in and out buttons and the audio fade in and out buttons, I want to create 2 functions, a fade in and a fade out function that can handle all 4, just so we can minimize the amount of code we're using. So if I wanted to say call fade in as a function, we actually can't pass an argument through an event listener like this. So what we need to do in our second argument is just type in function with parentheses, and we'll add our brackets, and then we'll bring this down here. And anything we put inside of here, we can now call a function and pass value through. So we're going to say fade in, and we want to pass 1 value through here. So inside of fade in, we're going to pass 1 property through, and this is just going to be the property that we want to add effects to or keyframe. So for the video fade in, we're going to want to pass through opacity. And then what I'm going to do is copy and paste the add event listener to these other 3 buttons here. So with a video, we want opacity, video opacity, but this one is fade out. And then with audio, we want to pass through audio levels. And we'll paste that here and change this to fade out. So now that we have our basic add event listeners set up for our first row here, let's go ahead and create our fade in and fade out functions. So I'll set up a function underneath called fade in, and remember we're passing through a property, so we'll just call it that. And then the same with the fade out function, we're passing through a property as well. So to start off our fade in function, I'm going to check if we have any layers selected first off. So I'll put in an if statement. We're going to actually reference a function here called Lair Check, and we're going to check the length if it's less than 1. And if the length of Lair Check is less than 1, we're just going to say please select at least 1 layer and return false to get out of this. So Lair Check is just going to be something we reference to check how many selected layers there are. It's going to be super simple, so we'll create a function called Lair Check, and we're simply going to say a variable called selected layers is equal to app.project.activeItem, or the active comp, and the selected layers. Selected layers will basically return an array of all the selected layers in a composition. So if we did it right now, we would see we have 3 selected layers from index 0 to 2. Then we're simply just going to return our selected layers. So first we're going to run Lair Check. It's going to return our selected layers. If we have less than 1 layer selected or none, we're going to tell the user to select a layer. If not, we're just going to say else, and this is going to be our actual functionality here. So inside of here, I'm going to create a variable called layers, which will set equal to app.project.activeItem, and again our selected layers. And then we're going to run a for loop through this array of layers. So we'll grab a var called I, we'll set it equal to 0, or the first index of an array. And for I is less than our layers.length, increment I by 1. And now we need to grab the property that we passed through here. So we'll go ahead and say variable this property is equal to our current indexed layer, and we'll grab the property called property because we're passing through opacity or audio levels. This is going to set this property equal to our layer that we currently have selected and the property called either opacity or audio levels. And now we're going to add an if statement, or two of them, to check what our property actually is. So I'll put in two if statements here. In the first one, we're going to check if this property is equal to opacity. And in the second one, we'll say this property is equal to audio levels. So if it's equal to one of these, what are we going to do? If it's equal to opacity, we're going to grab our property here, this property, which in this case would be equal to opacity. And we're going to set up a set values at times function. Now this is a function that requires two arguments, the first of which is an array of times, and the second of which is an array of values. So this is where our global variable opacity values or audio values is going to come in handy. So we'll go ahead and create two spaces of arrays here. And in the first one, again, we want our times. So if we're fading in, we're in the fade in function. If we're fading in, we want 2 points that have keyframes. The first of which is going to be at the start time, or 0 seconds. And the second keyframe needs to be at our fade seconds, or 1 second later. So we'll say fade seconds. And then in the second array, we're going to be putting in our values. So we'll say our opacity values index 0, which we set up as 0. And then the second one is 100. So we'll say opacity values index 1. So just to recap what this is doing is we're going through each of the layers we have selected. We're going to set this property equal to opacity or audio levels depending on which button we click. And then if it's opacity, we're going to set the opacity values at times or set up keyframes at the time 0 and 1 in this case for our fade seconds. And the values are going to be 0 to 100. So basically fading from 0 to 100% opacity. All right, now let's set this up for the audio levels. We'll go ahead and grab this property. And again, we're going to set values at times. And same thing, we're going to want to have two arrays here, one for times and one for the values. It's going to be the same for the times here, just 0 and fade seconds. For the values, it's going to be a bit different. With opacity values, we can just pass through one value, 0 or 100. But with audio levels, it's a little bit different. For each value that we pass through here, we actually want two values. We want one for the left audio and one for the right audio. So what we'll do is inside of the second argument of brackets here, I'm going to add another brackets. And we'll set this equal to audio values index 0, comma audio values index 0, which is basically going to set the first keyframe equal to negative 48 decibels on the left and right channels. Then after the second one here, go ahead and add a comma and another set of brackets. In this one, we're just going to say audio values index 1 and audio values index 1. So this is going to go in at 0 seconds and 1 second. Set the first keyframe equal to negative 48 decibels on both channels, and then set the second keyframe equal to 0 decibels on both channels. Alright, so now that we have our fade in function all finished up, we can basically just copy and paste all of this into our fade out function and just change a few things. So the only thing we really need to change are the set values at times properties. So to do this, we're going to change it up a bit. Instead of starting with 0, we're going to go ahead and grab our current layer, layers I, and we're going to grab the out point minus our fade seconds. And then the second keyframe is just going to be our current layer in our array we have selected and the out point. And then we're just going to reverse the indices of these opacity values rather than going from 0 to 100%, going from 100% to 0. So we'll add index 1 and then index 0. So for this property .setValuesAtTime, we're basically going to the end of our layer here and subtracting the amount of seconds, which should fade it appropriately. And we're going to want to do the same thing for our audio levels here. So I'll grab our current layer selected, grab the out point and subtract the fade seconds. And then just grab the current layer index and the out point. And same thing with this, we're going to reverse it from index 0 to 1 and index 1 to 0. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this in After Effects and see how it's working. And one thing I did mess up on the if statements here checking this property, we actually want to check the property argument we passed through here. And we'll also want to update this in the fade out function. So now if we go ahead and run this here, select a layer or two and click on fade in, ignore these alerts. Now if we go into the opacity of the two layers, you can see we have a nice fade occurring. Alright, so the last thing we need to do is to set up functionality for the second row of things we have. So what I'm going to do is below all of our event listeners, I'm going to add 4 more. And this time we can actually just have one line event listeners because we don't need to pass any arguments through. So the first thing I'll do is I'll grab my delete keyframes button and I'll add an event listener. We'll change the event name to the click. The handler for the first one is going to be delete keys, and again false for the third argument. And we can go ahead and paste this 3 times here. Change this to the delete expressions button. This one to the delete effects button, and the last one to reset transform button. And then for the functions, we got delete keys, delete expressions, delete effects, and reset transform. So now finally, let's go ahead and implement the last functionality into the script so we can have our workflow script done. So I'm going to start setting up my functions here. Call one, delete keys, delete expressions, delete effects, and reset transform. Alright, so in the actual script that I originally created, the functions that we're about to code are rather complex because when I went in to delete the keys or delete the expressions, I wanted to make sure that there was no keyframes or expressions on, say, the effects. But in this tutorial, we're just going to be programming them for the basic transform values. If you want to check out how you can go through the effects or any other properties, just check out the code or ask some questions in the comments and I should be able to help you out. So first thing we're going to do is actually set up the easiest one here, which is reset transform. And to reset our transform, I want to grab our layer check really quick, which we're going to want in every one of these functions. So if we don't have a layer selected, tell the user to. If not, then just like before, we're going to set a variable called layers equal to our app.project, our active comp, and our array of selected layers. And again, like before, we're going to loop through that array by saying a variable equal to 0, and that variable is less than layers.length and increment by 1 up. Now we can go ahead and reset our transform values. We'll grab our layers and the current index property. We'll start off with position, and we're going to set the value equal to something. And this is going to require 2 arguments, an x and a y basically. And to reset the position value, you basically need to divide the comp width and height divided by 2, and that will give you the basically default position value. So for the x, I'll grab our active item, which is equal to our comp, and we're going to grab the width divided by 2. And then for the height, we're also going to grab the active comp, and we're going to grab the height divided by 2. Now I can go ahead and paste this a few more times in here to get the other values. So we have scale, rotation, opacity, and anchor point. Let's go ahead and fill those in here. Alright, so for the default scale, we'll also need 2 values, and usually the default scale is just 100 by 100. The default opacity requires 1 value, so we'll set it equal to 100. and make sure you get rid of those brackets. Default rotation is also going to be 0, and the anchor point is going to be the same as the position. Alright, let's go ahead and move up here to the delete effects. Again, I'm going to paste our layer check in here. I'm sure there's a more efficient way, but this works just fine for now. So inside of delete effects, if we actually have some layers selected, we're again going to grab our layers and set that equal to our active item and selected layers. And I'm just going to copy this loop because we're going to be looping through the same thing here. Inside of our loop, we'll set a variable called numEffects, which is going to be the number of effects for the current selected layer. This is just going to be equal to our current layered index, effects, and the num properties, or the number of effects, basically. Then inside of this for loop, we'll create another one, and this time we're going to be running through our actual effects. So create a variable e, and we're going to set that equal to our numEffects. We're actually going to increment downwards. So while e is greater than or equal to 0, decrement e by 1. And the reason we're going to do this is if we had an effect applied here, or had a couple applied here, if we started at index 1 and deleted it, and then we try to go to index 2, there is no another index. It's actually just index 1. But if we start at index 2, delete it, and then go down to index 1, we can delete everything properly without running into issues. So simply inside of here, we're going to grab our indexed layers object here, and we're going to grab effect E and simply remove it. And that's actually it for the delete effects function. So let's move on to the delete expressions function. We'll add in our layer check and for loop just like before, and make sure we add our closing brackets here. So now inside of our delete expressions, we're actually just going to grab this down here with all of our transform values, paste it in here, and instead of set value, we just want to set dot expression equal to an empty string. And I'll go ahead and paste that for these other values here. And again, if you want to go ahead and delete expressions or keyframes from your effects, or say audio levels or something like that, check out the referenced file, and that has all the information in there. So that's actually it for the delete expressions function there. So let's finish off by getting rid of those pesky keyframes. I'm going to start off by pasting all of our layer check information in here. And again, closing the brackets. And for this, we're basically going to go through each transform property, check if it has any keyframes, and if it does, go into a function called delete these keys. So what we're going to do inside of our for loop here, we're going to have a bunch of if statements. The first of which is going to be checking if our current layer and the property position, if the number of keys in this property is greater than 0, so basically if it has any keys, we're going to run the function delete these keys, and we're going to pass two values through. One is our property name, so this case position, and the other is our layer. So inside of delete these keys, we're going to say property and layer, which is what we're passing through here. And inside of here, we're going to set up a variable called these keys. And this is just going to be a number to check how many keys we have. So we'll set this equal to our layer property that we imported and the number of keys. And then we're just going to use these keys inside of our for loop. So just like when we deleted our effects, we're going to want to decrement instead of increment our for loop. So we'll say var I is equal to these keys. And for I is greater than 0, we're going to decrement I. And then inside of our for loop, we're simply going to say layer.property, and again our property we imported through arguments, and we're going to remove our key with the index of I. So let's recap of what delete keys does here. We're going to run through all of our selected layers. First, we're going to check, does our position property have any keys? If it does, the number of keys it has is going to be greater than 0. So let's go ahead and run delete these keys. We'll pass through position for the property and our current layer. Then inside of delete these keys, we're going to basically loop through the number of keyframes in our property and remove each one. Now finally, to finish up the script, I'm going to copy and paste this if statement a few times. And instead of position, we'll say scale, opacity, anchor point, and rotation. Alright, so let's check out our script in After Effects and see how well it's working for us. Go ahead and run it in After Effects. And the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and delete our keyframes here. As you can see, it got rid of our opacity keyframes. And I want to reset the opacity to 100, so I'll reset our transform values. There we go. Now if I select all my layers, bring up the opacity and the audio levels, I can go ahead and fade in and out both of them. And just like that, we can quickly edit our video and create a custom workflow that works best for us. Alright guys, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. The reason I made this tutorial is because I've been making a lot of workflow scripts for people, and I thought it would be useful to share that knowledge with you guys. So be sure to hit the thumbs up button or smash it if you enjoyed the video. Hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified of when our new videos come out. If you have any suggestions for future videos, be sure to leave them in the comments down below, and we'll see you guys next time.